Forged, Bart Ehrman, coming up next. Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are, or at least some of them. We'll let Bart Ehrman make his case for that coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So, scary times we're in a bit with our third war theater, with the attack on Libya, the hope that Muammar Gaddafi will stop killing his own people and some sanity can be restored to that part of the world. And with the ongoing problems they're having in Japan. And, you know, we're just getting into the spring flooding season, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And this will be the time when a lot of people will turn to the Bible for solace. They'll find their favorite passages. They'll contemplate God, perhaps like last week in our conversation on Coast to Coast. They'll find a greater amount of peace by prayer and by meditation, regardless of whatever church, denomination, religion, whatever it is that they pursue. But would they feel the same way if those favorite passages of theirs had been forged before they were included in the Bible? That's the area of this new book from biblical scholar Bart Ehrman. We'll talk about forged, just what is in the Bible that Bart Ehrman claims is 100% completely forged. It's controversial. It may even be explosive for some. You'll hear about it next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Dr. Bart Ehrman, the Professor Bart Ehrman, who we've had on many times on Coast to Coast, was on my brain earlier this week on Coast to before we're thinking about Coast to Coast for this weekend. Good evening, Bart.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Nice to have you back again.
Thanks.
I was thinking about you because we had a guest on last week on Coast to Coast, a Dr. Newberg, Andrew Newberg, who wrote a book called How God Affects the Brain. And he's a radiologist and he's a neuroscientist, neuroresearcher, and he's at the University of Pennsylvania, and he did something like 5,000 scans of people who are thinking about God. And they would do a scan before and then a scan after, when they showed that, especially over prolonged periods of time, the brain develops new neural pathways. It reduces stress levels, that prayers and meditations about God, even amongst atheists and agnostics, create a greater sense of well-being and reduce stress hormones, which can lead to disease and early death. And I thought that's such an interesting relationship to the to religion. And I know that at one time you had been a conservative evangelical Christian until you started to study the classic languages and Semitic languages of the Bible, and you started to look deeper into the texts, and then you came to a place where you consider yourself agnostic to this still.
Yeah,
Bart?
That's right, agnostic. Okay. Yeah.
And he said that even agnostics who are thinking about God still get the same benefit from these neural pathways, that only people that don't do any thinking about it ever, even atheists who just think about their image of God, show a benefit in their brain, which I think is interesting. I thought it made me think of you because I was both finishing his book and reading yours at the same time.
Yeah, well, then I guess I'm in good shape. Because
you are.
As an agnostic, I think about God all the time.
Right. I think you've got to be the number one God-thinking agnostic in the country.
Yes, exactly. That's all I am.
So your brain, the effect on your brain didn't change at all from when you switched from being an evangelical Christian, a professor, to an agnostic.
No, probably not. Still got the same brain.
Yep, and who knows? It might have improved it. Maybe that's why you can write so many books.
Maybe so, yeah.
So the new book is so interesting, and you make the point at the beginning that once more, for a lot of biblical scholars, the concepts of this book are not new, but for the layperson, much of this material may not only be new, but it might be shocking and even maddening, because people don't like to use the F word when it comes to the Bible.
Well, that's right. And, I think one of the differences from my other books that are for popular audiences is that this book, well, for one thing, I mean, this book is based on more original research. It's not just popularizing things that other scholars have said, but the other thing is that scholars too are reluctant to say that parts of the Bible are forged, even though if you listen to what they're saying, that actually is what they're saying. It's just they don't like to use the F word either.
And the reason why they don't, they pull it right up to the edge of saying forged. Then really, instead of using forged, they use, $10 words with lots of syllables in them.
Yeah, right. So what you do is, instead of saying that a book is forged, you say that it's a pseudepigraphon.
Right.
Which sounds sophisticated and technical, but and scholars all the time will talk about pseudepigraphy and pseudepigrapha. But what a pseudepigraphon is, the literal meaning of the word pseudepigraphon, which they don't tell you, is it's a writing that is inscribed with a lie. So it's as bad as forged. People don't know what it means, and so it's okay to use it.
In this case, in the book Forged, you focus mostly on the New Testament. There's some references to the Hebrew Scriptures, but the bulk of this is on those books that are more recent. Why not more of the books of the Christian Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible? Why not focus on those and the names that are commonly associated as the authors of those books?
Right. Well, yeah, one could do that. I mean, and it's important to understand what I mean by the term forge, which of course you know, but maybe some listeners don't. When I use the word forge, I'm talking about somebody who wrote a book and claimed to be a famous person, even though they were someone else. And so in the New Testament, you have letters that claim to be written by Paul, which almost certainly were not written by Paul, written by somebody who said he was Paul. And so you do get that phenomenon somewhat in the Old Testament in a few places. I mean, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes claims to be written by King Solomon, but scholars are sure that Solomon didn't write it. It was written many hundreds of years after Solomon was dead, by somebody claiming to be Solomon. And so you get it there. You get it in the book of Daniel, which is claiming to be written by a prophet living in the 6th century BCE, when in fact it was written about 400 years later. So you do get the phenomenon some in the Old Testament, but the problem with the Old Testament is that most of the books don't, the authors themselves don't make any claims about themselves. So, for example, the book of Genesis doesn't claim to be written by Moses, so that when later people said it was written by Moses, it wasn't the author's fault.
Right.
And so I'm talking about books where the author is actually making a claim for himself.
And it goes out of his way to put data in the book to try to bolster the case that it was written by this famous person.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is a common technique of forgers in the ancient world, and it's still used by forgers today. You want your reader to think that you're the person you say you are, and so if you're claiming to be Peter, for example, and you're writing a book, Peter is Jesus' disciple, well, then you tell stories about how you and Jesus did things together, or you experienced things in Jesus' life, and that way your reader thinks that you really know what you're talking about, and that you must be the person you claim to be.
And this is more common in the New Testament. This is sort of unique to the New Testament that they don't have in the Old. They don't give. There aren't any examples in the Old Testament Scripture where they are going out of their way to claim to be somewhere or to claim to be doing something.
Well, the only two examples out of the entire Old Testament are the two books I mentioned, Ecclesiastes and Daniel. Most of the other books are either anonymous, so that the author didn't say who they were, or they're written by, or they're related to people who probably had something to do with it, like the book of Amos. Whoever, we don't know who Amos was, but the author isn't trying to make you think that he's some famous person that he wasn't.
In this case, it may not have been written, actually physically written by Amos, but these could have been the oral traditions that were passed down. Amos kept saying these things, Amos kept saying them, and other people kept repeating what Amos said until somebody finally put pen to paper.
Yeah, that's right. And so the author isn't trying to convince you, that he's somebody famous. It's just somebody, probably some guy named Amos who was a prophet, and later some of his teachings were put down into this book.
But the actual writer is echoing Amos. So there's an attempt at, sort of like how, my great-grandfather would have told a story that keeps getting passed down. And if I claimed the authorship of the story, that would be kind of a forgery. If I claimed it that I wrote it, it wouldn't be. If it was an oral, history that was passed down and repeated the exact same way, and then I finally wrote it down, I really should put my great-grandfather's name to it, because it's really his story, not mine.
Well, yeah, it gets a little bit, there's a lot of gray area. And so the thing is, if you had a famous grandfather and suppose you wanted to convey some message that was your message, but you were nobody, but your grandfather was somebody, and you wrote a book and claimed to be your grandfather, that would be a forgery, because you'd be claiming to be somebody you weren't. It's a little bit different if your grandfather actually left some notes or something behind, and you published those claiming to be your grandfather. Well, that's a little bit different from writing your own book claiming to be your grandfather.
But claiming to be, and this is why I'm making this point, we're talking with Bart Ehrman about the book Forged. We'll get into more specifics about the New Testament scripture here in just a second, but claiming to be and saying the story is by are two different things to me. So the reason why I say Amos, you mentioned the prophet Amos, if I'm the one who's actually writing down exactly what was said by Amos, or as it was repeated for 2 generations, and then finally I put it down on paper, I'm going to put down Amos. Amos said this. These are Amos's words. I'm just collecting them in a different form. And I think that's
right.
different than saying I'm Amos.
That's right. And that is different from writing your own prophecies and claiming to be Amos.
Right. Because that's really what we start to see more of in the New Testament, as you claim in the book Forged. And I think most scholars would agree with you. To what degree, that may be a matter of debate, but that there are books particularly in the Christian part of the Bible where the focus is on taking the name of somebody who had the reputation and the authority and attaching it to a personal agenda that had nothing to do with the original person.
Yeah, or, it either had nothing to do with it, or it ended up being an irrelevant thing. If you claim to be Peter, and it turns out you're talking about something that Peter might have talked about, the thing is you have no way of knowing, because you're living 40 years later or something, and so you've got a message, and you want people to read your message, and so you say that you are Peter.
And so this is not, as you said, this is really not controversial among most scholars, the idea that many of the writings of, say, Peter or Paul are not actually the writings of Peter and Paul, and in fact may be contrary to what Peter or Paul would have said in their lifetime.
Right. So there's very little debate among scholars about a book like 2 Peter in the New Testament, which claims to be written by Peter. The author says he was there to see Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. He was one of Jesus' companions. And but scholars are quite unified that whoever wrote 2 Peter, it wasn't Peter. So for scholars, that's not controversial. I think for people who don't know the scholarship, it sounds like a fairly bold claim. What scholars are reluctant to do is to call that a forgery, and that's what I'm trying to do in my book, is to show that, in fact, that is what it is. It's a forgery.
And the claim is, and this is what when I went through seminary, I heard this said a lot, is that this was a common technique, and that this was sort of like what they would have done in ancient Greece or Rome, where the author was writing in the school of somebody famous. And so it's not fair to call it a forgery, because by that standard, it really wasn't, there was nothing wrong about it at the time.
Right, that's what I learned in seminary too. And one of the things I try to show in my book is that view is precisely wrong. That in fact we don't have evidence that this was widely practiced. I have to be clear about it. It was widely practiced, but it wasn't widely practiced and approved. In other words, there are a lot of things that happen a lot that are not widely approved. I mean, people cheat on their taxes all the time, but it doesn't mean that there's social approval of it. Or people have affairs and commit adultery all the time, but it doesn't mean that it's socially approved. And forgery is like that. It happened a lot, but it wasn't socially approved, and we don't have any evidence, or we have very, very, very little evidence that this happened in the philosophical schools and was an acceptable practice. It may have happened, but it wasn't acceptable.
And there are examples of people who were either exposed as a forger or they were maybe even in a lighter sense of the word prosecuted for being a forger. But then there were also examples we can know, or we know for sure, that there was a profit motive even before the Bible had been codified as we know it today. There was a profit motive for faking books of the Bible.
Profit is a good term for this. So in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, you have a lot of instances of forgery, which is one of the things I talk about in the book, and forgers would sometimes, in antiquity, claim to be a famous author so that they could get paid for their book. And so if a library, for example, is collecting the writings of Plato and is willing to pay gold for them, then a lot of treatises of Plato will start showing up because people can make money off of it. And so that's one of the widely attested motives for forgery in the ancient world. And one question I deal with in the book is whether that motive actually applies to the Christian stuff, because when libraries are collecting the writings of Plato, they're not collecting the writings of Paul, because
right.
Paul, of course, is not a famous author in the ancient world. He's just this Christian who had these ideas. And so there's a genuine question about whether Christian forgers were actually doing it for the money, or if they had other reasons for doing what they did.
Well, if to go down that line of thinking, I think it's easy to assume that if the people of the first and second century of since Christ were exactly the same type of people that we are today, and I think we are. I don't think we've changed much. That if they had the same motives, if they were wired the same way that we're wired today, then a lot of people might have forged their letters and ascribed them to Paul in order to win an argument.
Yeah, I think that is the primary motive among the early Christians. I talk about maybe, 8 or 9, 10 different motives widely in the Greek and Roman worlds, but this is it for the Christians. You're living in a situation 20 or 30 years after Paul, and you have a point of view that is controversial, and you don't have any authority, but because you're a nobody, but you write up your view. And you write a letter embracing your point of view, and in order to get people to accept your point of view, you claim to be Paul, because people pay attention to Paul. And so it's in order to, as you say, it's in order mainly to win your argument.
Yeah, and to win your argument and to try to influence people, and perhaps even on the other side of that, maybe to raise your profile, even if you aren't the person that is doing the writing. If you're the person who did the finding of that text, or you're the person who's a local, you've been making this argument locally, and suddenly a text shows up that bolsters your case, that makes you sound like you were the smart person who got it all along, well, then you do, in the end, perhaps enjoy a cash benefit, or just kind of through the back door.
Well, that's right. And, it actually comes down to very important issues. I mean, there are letters of Paul in the New Testament that indicate that women are not allowed to participate in the actively in church. They're not to speak, they're not to teach, they're not to exercise authority. Well, these books actually were not written by Paul. They're written by somebody later claiming to be Paul who had that point of view. And in order to make sure the women were silent, the author of 1 Timothy, claiming to be Paul, in Paul's name says that women can't exercise any authority. So this is actually an important aspect of early Christianity, that these books, some of these books, like 1 Timothy, are actually not by Paul, but they're forged and they represent a point of view that Paul didn't have.
I think that's whenever you say the F word, that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people, because the idea that the Bible contains forgeries, even if they were well-intended forgeries, even if that's going to create some ripple effects when we get to the phone calls coming up later on this evening. And I'm all for taking the calls. I think you're making a fair claim. Why use a fancy academic term for it when we have a modern word that's much more simple, if only because it also has much more impact? The word is forged. Bart Ehrman's new book out about which books of the Bible are forged. We'll get into a little bit more of this too when we talk about Revelation. You can't help but talk about the apocalypse these days, with predictions that are coming in May and then maybe 2012 for other people about the book of Revelation. So we'll talk about whether or not that is a forgery, or to degree that is a forgery, on the way. And then, even if they are forgeries, can they contain truth? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. The book is Forged, Bart Ehrman's new book. He's got a series of them, and we've interviewed him over the years. This is the book, though, that may make the biggest claim, or at least the one that some people are going to find very challenging. The untold story of forgeries in the Bible, next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So I just mentioned before the bottom of the hour that we would get to the book of Revelation coming up. I'm just reminded of that because every day when I drive home now, I drive past signs that say Christ is returning May 21st, 2011. And there are a lot of people who are buying into this, obviously, some people who are investing in it, or they wouldn't be able to afford to put up billboards everywhere. And so that brings us, in some cases, back to the book of Revelation, as a lot of people expect that there would be end times in their lifetime. And that's kind of a theme that runs through Forged, by Bart Ehrman, writing in the name of God, one of the subtitles for the book, because there was both another apocalypse that almost made it into the Bible, which was considered to be forged, and a lot of people consider the apocalypse of John, the one that did make it into the Bible, to be forged.
Right. So the book of Revelation is an interesting example because the author claims to be somebody named John, and so people call it the Apocalypse of John or the Revelation of John. And my own view of this is that somebody named John actually wrote the book, but he's not John, the disciple of Jesus. This again is not a particularly revolutionary claim. This is something that scholars have argued for many centuries. Scholars have known that whoever wrote this wasn't the same person who wrote the Gospel of John, for example, but people today tend to think that this, in fact, is written by the disciple of Jesus, John, and they're wrong about that. This is a case where of a phenomenon that's a little bit different that I call homonymy, which is a word that people don't know, and because nobody uses it. But it means written by somebody with the same name as a famous person, and so that's the deal with the Book of Revelation, is that there was a famous person named John the son of Zebedee, but he almost certainly is not the person who wrote this book.
Well, I think what's important to mention then, too, is then does it lose its value as an apocalypse, as a prediction, right? And at the time, there were a lot of people that were looking at whether they included the Apocalypse of John or the Apocalypse of Peter or both, and they looked at Apocalypse of John with a jaundiced eye. It's really one of the books that almost didn't make it into the Bible.
That's absolutely right. Into the 4th century, we have church fathers arguing about whether to accept the Apocalypse of John, and there were church fathers who were adamant that, in fact, it should not belong in the New Testament. It was the last book to be widely accepted as part of the New Testament, and the argument hinged on who wrote the thing. And finally, church fathers concluded that John the son of Zebedee wrote it. This is hundreds of years later. They didn't have any way really of knowing who wrote it, but they thought that John the son of Zebedee had written it, and he was one of the disciples, and so they included it. Well, they were wrong about that because John the son of Zebedee did not write it, and so that creates, I think, a theological problem for a lot of Christians. If the Bible contains books that were accepted on false premises, what does that do? I mean, does it mean that the book should no longer be accepted as part of the Scriptures or not? So, I don't get into that question in the book, and because I'm not arguing we should throw books out of the New Testament, but I do think that the author issue is important to recognize that here we have a book that was accepted as part of the New Testament because people thought it was written by somebody who, in fact, did not write it.
Well, and I think it's a fair thing, though, that in effect you touch on it, on the idea of which books are in and which ones are out on what basis. You can't help but wonder then, how much stake have people put into the book of Revelation, that a book which was you could make an argument for was forged, although, as you say, more likely honestly written by a guy named John, and he never himself makes the claim. He never himself makes false claims.
Yeah, that's what I argue in the book, is that the author doesn't claim to be a famous person. It's only people living much later who said he was a famous person, and so that's a different thing. That's a different thing. And you mentioned this other apocalypse, the Apocalypse of Peter. That's a book that almost did make it into the New Testament. There were people into the 4th, 5th century who thought it was part of the New Testament, and it is a forgery. It claims to be written by Peter, and in fact, it was not.
Okay, so good. That means then, doesn't it, that a lot of the church fathers were attuned to the idea of what was and what wasn't a forgery? It wasn't like they would let in anything. They were trying to discriminate, weren't they, between what they could prove to be forgeries for what they had on, at their hands at the time, and what they were willing to accept as being valid.
That's right. This sounds like, it may sound like this is something that scholars are doing today, but they've just invented this entire this way of proceeding. But in fact, in early Christianity, this is one of the things the church fathers argued about. Is the book of 1 Peter written by Peter or not? And some said yes, some said no. And but this was a topic of conversation because they obviously did not want to include books in the New Testament that were forgeries.
So to their credit, I mean, they were conscientious about it. It wasn't like some people have claimed, and there's a lot of people that will sort of make up stories about how the Bible was thrown together somewhat willy-nilly, and that in fact wasn't the case. But it still doesn't mean that they didn't get a couple of curveballs past, into the batter's box, right? I mean, there's a couple, and we know that from, as you mentioned, Paul, that of the majority of the things that are ascribed to Paul were not written by Paul. I'm almost impossible for maybe 6 of the 13 were not written by Paul, or 7 of the 13. So there are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul, and scholars are pretty sure that 7 of them really were written by Paul, and so those are called the undisputed Pauline epistles. And the other 6, there are some debates about a few of them, but most scholars think Paul didn't write them. And in the early church, they had a lot more books that claimed to be written by Paul that were judged by the church fathers to be forgeries. But the problem was that one of the ways the church fathers made this kind of decision wasn't on the basis of some kind of careful linguistic analysis like modern scholars use. Often it was because church fathers didn't like the theology of a book. They thought that it stated views that they didn't agree with, and so they said, well, Paul obviously didn't write this because it has false views. But they judged what a false view was in light of what they themselves happened to believe. Well, but in a way, I mean, what else did they have? I mean, right? I mean, they if they were trying to do it, that may have been all that they had, was just, does this seem consistent with the Paul that we know? And their idea that Paul wouldn't have ever had a contradictory idea. I mean, I think it's the same criteria we're using now. We look at 1 Timothy, where Paul talks down the role of women, but in other places in the Bible, Paul talks up deaconesses and other people that were central to the evangelism of Jesus.
Well, that's right. That's how we know that these 6 letters that are disputed, that's how we know that Paul probably didn't write them, is because they do stand at odds with what Paul himself says somewhere else. And the church fathers were, of course, you're right. I mean, it was completely legitimate for them to use that kind of criterion. It's just that they didn't have the kinds of analytical tools that we have available to us today to make a definitive decision. And if they had a book that seemed to contradict their own points of view, then they concluded, well, an apostle could not have possibly written this.
Now, the problem with this, and for people that think, okay, well, this is just, a bunch of theologians talking about the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin, there are some real-life consequences for these forgeries, or for at least for the validity that's given to some of these scriptures that are falsely attributed to an apostle or somebody famous, and that when you elevate the writing of some person, we don't know who it is, to be the same as being a follower, like a direct follower, somebody that was in the presence of Jesus, then that elevates whatever it is that they claim in the writing to be truer than just some other schmo on the street. And that leads us to what I think we can say some fairly dire consequences for Jews over the years, is that some of these documents that are in the Bible that are falsely attributed to somebody like a disciple it lead directly to the persecution and death of millions of Jews over the years.
That's right. This really does have serious consequences. So, an example of that sort of thing is that in the Gospels of the New Testament, you come to the Gospel of John, which is the last of the Gospels to be written, and it does say some very nasty things about the Jews. I mean, in John chapter 8, Jesus says that Jews are the children of the devil, as opposed to being the children of God. And obviously, somebody later reading that takes it quite seriously and casts aspersions on Jews. And it's thought, and that's because John is thought to be an inspired book. Now the Gospel of John is not what I would call a forgery, because the author doesn't claim to be John. It's written anonymously, but later people took this anonymous book and said it was written by Jesus' own disciple who was there to hear these things being said. In fact, it wasn't written by somebody there who heard these things said. It was written by somebody living several decades later in a different country, speaking a different language, who's recording traditions that he's heard about Jesus, but there are all sorts of reasons for thinking that these traditions he's heard about Jesus are not historically accurate.
And so I think that's really the key claim then, again, just to point out what you're saying about forged, is that they are falsely attributed, as I was making the point to say, to somebody famous, and that even that itself has consequences. Or you look at the number of women who were prevented from church leadership over the millennia, just because on the basis of 1 Timothy that wasn't really written by Paul, and that if Paul were alive today, he would see the line in there about how women should be silent in church, and he might have been absolutely aghast at that, but there was nothing he could do about it.
Well, that's right, because in Paul's own letter, 1 Corinthians, in chapter 11, he talks about, women do speak in church, and he approves of it. They can prophesy in church, and so that's okay. But it's more than okay. It was part of Paul's churches. But then somebody later writes a book claiming to be Paul, in which he silences women, and we still live with this today. In the Catholic Church, of course, there can't be women priests. Well, it's largely because of this passage in 1 Timothy. Or in a lot of Protestant churches, women can't be pastors. Why not? Because of this passage in 1 Timothy, but it's a book that Paul didn't write.
And oddly enough, the person who wrote it very likely was a Gnostic Christian, not a mainstream Jewish Christian or even Gentile Christian of his day, but somebody who had kind of a radical view that sneaks that into the Bible.
Well, when you claim to be somebody famous and you write your views and your views get accepted as that famous person, it completely changes how history remembers that person. And so that's why Paul goes down in history today among people with a more kind of liberated point of view. Paul is looked upon as having these kind of misogynistic tendencies. And it's not really fair to Paul because he didn't have these tendencies. It's simply because somebody later, claiming to be Paul, wrote this book, and then it got included in the New Testament.
But again, I mean, there are other examples of things that are it's like the one voice got louder. So the voice of Timothy gets louder than other places that seem to contradict Timothy. And that's part of what leads to great biblical debates and what leads to denominationalism, because one group will elevate one passage over the other passage. But the fact is, it got in there. And
it got in there, and so what ended up happening is people would read the rest of Paul's letters through the lens provided by this letter. And so if you have this very clear statement that women cannot speak in church and can exercise no authority over a man and cannot teach, when you have that stated so clearly in 1 Timothy, then you think, well, that's what Paul thought. And so then you interpret all of Paul's other writings in light of that very clear statement. So Paul seems to be opposed to women, but it's only because you're using this particular book, not written by Paul, as a way of interpreting the rest.
We see this to this day, and I'll mention an example I saw recently, and I know that you have others in the book, Forged. But there was an interesting documentary about Ronald Reagan right around the time of his the anniversaries that were being celebrated back in February, and there are a lot of politicians today who invoke the name of Ronald Reagan when they're trying to either gain popularity or try to get support for a particular idea, and in doing so, claim that if Ronald Reagan were alive today, he would agree with me on X and X, or that I am living the legacy of Ronald Reagan on the subject of Y. When you actually go back, and it's not that far, you don't have to go back but 25 years to go back and look at what Ronald Reagan actually said, and it would have been completely contradictory to what this person is claiming today, but nobody bothers to even go back and look at the source material. What would Reagan have thought? Because it's right there.
No, it's completely astounding, and it happens all the time in American history. I mean, and where it happens even more, of course, is when people talk about the founding fathers, and they come up with all sorts of claims about the founding fathers that are absolutely false. But it is striking that this kind of activity can go on with somebody who was alive in our living memory. I mean, I was very much alive and conscious of what Ronald Reagan was doing, and yet here people just a couple of decades later can make these astounding claims. So it just shows that, in fact, it shouldn't be thought that odd that people were doing this back in biblical times as well.
And they're naming the Ronald Reagans of their day,
yes.
and using that as a way of backing up their claims. So why is it so hard to say forged then? I mean, if the evidence is so clear that, say, just again, to use from the Christian New Testament, 1 Timothy was not written by Paul, and yet the author makes claims that it was written by Paul, why aren't we comfortable just saying forged?
Well, it's a good question, and I wish I knew the answer. I think the deal is that we're talking about the Bible here, which is sacred scripture for Christians, and so even scholars who think that these books are pseudepigraphic are more willing to say they're pseudepigraphic than saying that they're forged, and it's because the word forgery has such negative connotations. And there's a tradition within scholarship that in the ancient world, this kind of activity didn't have negative connotations. And so what I try to show in my book is that view is wrong. I try to show that in the ancient world, they also thought of this kind of literary activity, where an author would claim to be someone famous, that they called that lying, and they thought it was deceitful, and they didn't accept it. And so I'm really in the book trying to make a case that the word forged is the appropriate word, because for us it connotes deception and lying, and that's exactly what ancient people thought about it.
And at the risk of doing the same misrepresentation of Ronald Reagan that some people are doing, and doing this in the name of church fathers, I would make the claim, I don't know how you would, that if certain church fathers were alive today and they looked at what we codified as the Bible and what we considered to be acceptable source material for what was included in the Bible, they might also say forged. Some of them would. Maybe not all of them, but some of them would be willing to go, that was forged.
So the ancient authors who talk about this phenomenon, of course, they weren't speaking English, so they didn't use the word forged. They had two words that they used for this kind of book, and the church fathers used these two words. One word for a book that is written by somebody claiming to be a famous person when he's not. One word they use for that is the Greek word pseudos, which is the word that means lie. And so they called these books lies. The other word is even more derogatory. They would call these books nothos. Well, the word nothos means bastard. And so, an illegitimate child, a bastard. And so they called these books lies and bastards. So they didn't approve of these things, and they didn't look the other way. They actually called them what they thought they were, which was nasty things. And I don't think that we should shy away from calling them what they are either.
Well, and there are more than just books of the Bible at stake here, too. I want to skip ahead to a later chapter in Forged and talk about some influential books in modern history which were proposed to be real, which were forged, but that some people to this day don't realize are forged. And they still quote them as though they were real, or they still quote the material that was in them as real. And to me, that's as vivid and as recent as a hugely popular book and movie. More on that coming up next with Bart Ehrman. Forged is his new book, and as usual, it has a beautiful, very lush, very cool illustration on the cover, too. All of his books are well done. Whether you agree with them or not, worth reading. We'll get to what we should know about other forged material next on Coast to Coast. Well, yeah, I mean, they were popular. They were passed around. The epistles, which later get collected as the majority of the New Testament, and the majority of them may have been totally forged. Yet, scholars don't even like to use the F word. Bart Ehrman's not scared of that, but he's not the only one out there talking about forgeries. We'll get to more of those coming up next on Coast to Coast. So, and I want to take a moment here because I know the phones are already hot, Bart. I'm already seeing them ringing like crazy, and I know that a lot of people want to get in on this conversation coming up next hour, is when we'll take some calls. That part of what you say in the book, Forged, your new book that's out, is that just because something isn't factual doesn't mean it doesn't contain truth.
Well, that's right. So, what I'm talking about in the book has to do only with whether an author is telling the truth about who he is. And so is the person writing this letter really Peter when he claims to be Peter? That's a different question from whether what he writes about, say, God or the human condition or the world, whether he writes about that is true or not. I mean, he could be right. He could say something that's actually true, even though he's lying about himself. And so my concern in this book is simply with the claim of the author about his identity. Is he telling us the truth or not? And that's the truth claims of the book otherwise have to be judged on some other criteria.
Well, to me, I mean, I've been aware of these things for a very long time and very interested in the subject, but they don't shake my faith like it shook yours. I mean, you went from being a hardcore conservative evangelical believer to agnostic in a few jumps.
Well, there were some jumps, and I think what this kind of knowledge I think, shows is that if you accept what historians are saying about the Bible, it's very hard to be a fundamentalist. You can't really think that the Bible is without any errors in it or that there are any problems with the Bible, because the Bible is filled with problems. And so for me, the first jump was away from being a fundamentalist Christian to becoming a more open-minded and I guess you would say a liberal Christian, and I was that for many years. This kind of information is not what led me to become an agnostic at all, because I think it's irrelevant to the question about whether God exists. I mean, if somebody claimed to be Peter and wrote a book, I mean, it has no relevance to the question of whether God exists or not. My agnosticism came about because of my wrestling with the problem of why there's suffering in the world.
Sure.
Which is unrelated to this question.
Except to say, and I appreciate the difference you're drawing on that, except to say, though, that we also get into a case where a lot of people do, where they say if anything in the Bible is false, then it's all false. And so there was a connection to, going from believing that it had to be sort of this ironclad thing. It's either ironclad or it's garbage. I mean, it's sort of in that extreme sense of nuancing in Scripture. And I think that for a lot of people, that sets them down the road, that if you can prove one thing false in the Bible, then they completely lose their faith on that basis alone. So for a lot of people, that's the paradigm.
That's right, and I think that's just a remnant of fundamentalism. It's a way of kind of turning fundamentalism inside out. That it's all one way or the other. It's all completely false or it's all completely true. Well, I don't think the world works like that. The world is filled with a lot of things in between, and you can't simply say it's all true or false. And one of the things I try to insist in my book is that you don't have to absolutely give up your faith in God if you agree with this idea that there are forgeries in the Bible. I mean, my closest friends are all people who are scholars of the Bible. I mean, that's the group I run around with. Most of them, in fact, are believing Christians, and most of them agree with just about everything that I say in this book. So this doesn't necessarily lead to a loss of faith.
Right. You count me in that group, although when you say you run around with a bunch of biblical scholars, really? Is there a lot of running around? Do you really do a lot of fun things together?
Well, yeah, these are not fundamentalists. These are good drinking buddies.
Okay, all right. I just want to understand. Some people say running around, and I don't know. I've known a lot of biblical scholars. All right, so they do most of their running when they're in seminary. That's it tends to end later on. All right, but all right, now let me. I'll give you another example of this. I think is very. I was hearkening back to this. And the importance of understanding what a forgery is and the impact. You look at something non-biblical like the Da Vinci Code, which is a very popular novel that was based on, at least in part, on the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was based in part, or I would say maybe even largely, on a forgery. And that being the so-called documents that were found in France that we know later on were forged by Pierre Plantard, this guy who even went to jail once for being a forger, an extreme right-wing pro-Nazi forger who was trying to create a false lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene in France, which would eventually have led to perhaps him, Pierre Plantard, being made the king of France. That there was this sort of tortured way of thinking that they created to try to bolster the claims for the return of the monarchy in France, but it would be a right-wing monarchy this time, and that was the claim, and it ends up being this hugely popularized notion. A lot of what they made up out of thin air ends up being the basis of the Da Vinci Code, which is still by a lot of people accepted as fact, told as fiction.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a scary thing that people learn about historical events, like the Emperor Constantine and his impact on Christianity, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that they get their information from something like the Da Vinci Code, which is, as you say, it's the so-called research in it is based on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which itself is based on a forgery. So these are things that actually impact how people look at the world, and so the whole issue of forgery ends up being very significant.
And I think you think about the movie, The Da Vinci Code, which didn't do too well in the United States or the UK, did huge business in Asia. And it's a scary thought to me that is what a lot of people are using as their lens into Christianity is the Da Vinci Code, the movie. And they're looking at that, and that's how they look at the Vatican. They use that movie in, Singapore and Thailand or whatever to inform their view of the Vatican.
Yeah, well, it's a scary thing. I tell my students that if they really want to know about the history of the Middle Ages, the way to do that is not to watch The Search for the Holy Grail, the Monty Python. And
right.
If you want to learn about the history of early Christianity, the best way to do it is not to read the Da Vinci Code. But that is. You're right. That's where a lot of people get their information, because, of course, it's a lot more interesting to read than it is to watch the movie than it is to read what historians who actually devote their lives to this kind of research actually have to say in their books, because historians tend not to be nearly as interesting as novelists.
And the same thing can be said of the so-called Protocols of Zion. These were forged documents that represented. Now we know were written by the early version of the KGB. They were propaganda that was out there to try to destabilize the support for the Jews, make it easier to have pogroms, make it easier eventually maybe even to the Holocaust. And they were completely forged documents about supposedly the vast international Jewish conspiracy. And again, there's forgeries then that are accepted as truth from people that end up leading to other people's demise.
I think it's really important for people to use their heads when they are, when they're thinking about historical documents and historical events. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book on forgeries in the Bible is because I think people are so gullible that they need to train themselves to be more critical, because the failure to be more critical leads to all sorts of heinous problems, including the one you're pointing to now, the kinds of anti-Semitism that are still rampant in the world today. A lot of anti-Semitism goes back to documents that are forged, and I think people need to be more critical when they're looking at history and looking at documents like this.
Well, and that's where, back to your book, we start to hear about especially documents that were forged around the crucifixion, the central event for Christians, and the claims that have been made both for and against Christ's experience on the cross, and how a lot of these were completely accepted as truth and amazing archaeological finds for years before they were dismissed as forgeries. And you give some interesting examples in the book.
Well, yeah, so, we do have, of course, we have the Gospels in the New Testament, which are anonymous, so I would not include them among forgeries, although, as I do point out in the book, they're falsely attributed to people who didn't actually write them, but the authors did make these claims. You get later writings which actually claim to be written by apostles that talk about the crucifixion, some really interesting stories that claim to be written by Peter. We have a Gospel of Peter, for example, and it's interesting that this Gospel of Peter, which was maybe 30 or 40 years after the New Testament Gospels, it's a forgery. It claims to be written by Peter. It wasn't written by Peter. It's even more anti-Jewish than anything you get in the New Testament. And so what happens is people, when they write forgeries, they adopt their own points of view, and they put forth their points of view in the name of someone else to get this point of view heard. And this is one of the reasons that anti-Judaism took off so much in early Christianity, is because people were forging documents, claiming to be apostles, and embodying their own personal anti-Jewish views.
And it's hard to get in the mind of everybody who wrote against the Jews in the first century or the early second century, although some of it I've always heard attributed to the idea that considered like Judaism was dead. I mean, like after the temple was smashed, after the Romans brought the hammer down on Jerusalem, the thought was is that this was the past. They were not the future. That Gentiles and the Roman Empire, that was the future. And so the evangelists were using Judaism to try to advance the validity of their claim in order to be more appealing to the Gentiles and the Romans.
Yeah, that's a point of view that is put out there a lot, and I personally think that it's just the opposite. That the reason that Christians are attacking Jews in all this anti-Jewish literature, some of which is forged, is precisely because Judaism was a threat to the early Christian church, and it was a living threat. And, I think that explains better why there's such animosity, is because Christians were in competition with Jews for converts and for respectability. And so in order to advance their own causes, they had to attack Jews and Judaism.
Well, it's a fair point you make. The interesting part is where, as in the Gospel of Peter, where how Pontius Pilate is portrayed as even more of a victim of this than we know he would have been. He was a very powerful man in real life, and they make him out to be like, this poor guy who got sucked into the middle of this dispute amongst the Jews.
That's right. So in the Gospel of Peter, in fact, Pilate is extremely innocent when it comes to Jesus' death. It's the Jews who are guilty. And we have later forgeries that are even more interesting. We have books that claim to be written by Pilate himself, letters claiming to be written by Pilate, in which Pilate writes to the Emperor Tiberius and says that he's done this awful thing. He's crucified the Son of God, and now the Jews made him do it, and he really wished he hadn't now. And in some of the later forged literature, Pilate actually converts to be a Christian. And so in some parts of the Christian church today, still, Pilate has been sanctified as a Christian saint.
I've never heard that before. Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, the logic is that Christians made Pilate more and more innocent, because if Pilate's innocent, who's guilty? Well, it's those damn Jews.
Right.
And so that's why the innocence of Pilate. But it's all based on these forgeries that came about in later centuries.
Well, then, and in many centuries after that, then the forgery of the death sentence of Jesus Christ as written by Pontius Pilate.
That's right. Yeah, I talk about some of these 19th century forgeries in the book, in which this is one of them, where you have an alleged discovery of the actual writ of Pilate condemning Jesus to death, which is just something that was made up many, many centuries later.
But a lot of people believed it at first. It was considered to be the archaeological find of the century.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's why I keep trying to push people to be more critical and not simply to accept something because they see it written down someplace. Just because it's written doesn't make it true.
Well, and let's go through the reasons why we know it could not possibly have been the death sentence of Jesus Christ as written by Pontius Pilate, because he wrote it in Hebrew, supposedly, which would never, right? And what are the other reasons why this could not possibly have been a valid document?
Well, there are all sorts of kind of funny things about it, including there's a whole list of witnesses who allegedly who had borne testimony to this death of to this document, and but some of them are names that didn't exist in the ancient world, for example, that are French names that in fact.
Right. Capet or something like that is in there.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So.
It wasn't even a Hebrew or a Roman or a Greek name.
Yeah.
Okay, and then but then you're not alone. I want to mention some of the other ones from the last chapter of the book. The crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness.
Yes.
This was another 19th century forgery?
Yeah. So this kind of thing seemed to show up a lot, where you'd have these kind of eyewitness reports, and so modern scholars have had no trouble exposing these things. This one thing, this crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness, is actually based on a kind of a novel that was written in the 19th century by a German scholar, and it was actually a novel, but then somebody later took it as a serious piece of writing, kind of like somebody taking the Da Vinci Code today and writing a history based on it, and so that's where this crucifixion of Jesus by an eyewitness comes from. Is somebody's forging something on the basis of this novel that was written in the 19th century.
And the same thing with the unknown life of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, this was actually a very popular book for a long time, and the reason I think it was popular is because it explains what people have long wondered. Where did Jesus get all his wisdom from? If he grew up in some little rural place in Galilee, how is it that he was so wise? And so people today still think, maybe Jesus traveled to India and he learned the wisdom of the Brahmins, and that's exactly what happens in this particular book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, is that Jesus allegedly, he goes off to Tibet and he learns from the Buddhists, and then he comes back for his public ministry. And so this was completely exposed as a forgery by scholars who were able to show that the person who claimed to discover this book was the guy who actually wrote it, and he made the whole thing up.
Right, but they had to go to India. So they had to go to the monasteries. They had to go find the places where he said he had been to go talk to the abbots who said, nah, he was never here.
That's exactly right. So
because up until that point, he made a fortune. He was the Da Vinci Code writer of his day. He made a fortune on it.
He did, and because he didn't say this was fiction. He said this was fact, and he made a ton of money off of it until they found out that in fact he just made the whole thing up. It's still quoted. I think you could even say some people like Marcus Borg, who's a popular writer, still kind of maintains an interest in that belief that Jesus spent time with Buddhists. I didn't know that about Marcus Borg, but I think that there's almost zero chance that Jesus went off to India to study, or that he
I have his book Jesus and Buddha, and in which he compares the sayings of Jesus and compares the sayings of Buddha. And I think the thought was that somewhere there had to have been some sort of cross-pollinization that had taken place.
Okay.
But I don't know that he says he actually went to India. I'll have to go look it up here in just a second. Anyway, I've got the book on my shelf, and I'll go pull it up right now. We're talking about Forged, Bart Ehrman. That brings us to the Passover plot. And I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's give the numbers here coming up next. We'll start to get to a couple of calls by the end of this hour. The feeling I'm getting by looking at the phones is that they're crazy busy and everybody wants to get on it. So why don't we? I'll give away part of this next half hour, and we'll start taking some calls early for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged, Writing in the Name of God: Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. It's hard for me to read the cover in the dark here. Sorry about that. I had to really hold it up to the faint light I have in my studio. And so we'll give you the numbers next, and we'll start working to the conversation the way on Coast to Coast. Well, just to be accurate, I went to go find my copy of Jesus and Buddha, the parallel sayings from Marcus Borg. I can't find any place here yet where he says that he believes that Jesus and Buddha, or that Jesus and even Buddhism might have interacted. But I hear that from so many other people that I've just sort of accepted it in my head. So my apologies if I've misspoken there. I know it came up recently in the chat room. We were doing a chat for the Coast Insiders, and somebody brought up did I believe that Jesus went to India and learned Christianity as he interpreted it, as he learned Judaism or wisdom as he interpreted it from Asia, from the Orient, and I said there's no evidence of that, but there are some interesting parallel sayings, and that does exist. But I did find something. I did grab the Da Vinci Code down off the shelf in the break there, and I want to share an opening page from Dan Brown's book as it pertains to the book by Bart D. Ehrman. Forged is his new book. We gave you the numbers. You can jump into the conversation next. Let's all be civil. Let's play in the sandbox nicely as we're talking about which books of the Bible are 100% complete forgeries. At least according to Bart Ehrman, coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. I want to talk about the Passover plot here in just a second, too, with Bart Ehrman that gets a mention in the book Forged. Although the majority of the book is about the books that were and were not included in the Bible that were clearly forged. As you make the argument, it's just that scholars don't like to use that F word. I want to read you something from the beginning of the Da Vinci Code. Okay, Bart?
Okay.
Here's the first page. Under boldface type, it says fact. This is before the story begins. Fact. The Priory of Sion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. In 1975, Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as Les Dossiers Secrets, identifying numerous members of the Priory of Sion, including Sir Isaac Newton, Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci. What he doesn't mention there is, yes, they did find them in Paris's National Library, but they were found by the people who planted them there, by the people who wrote them. The people that forged them were the ones that found them and said, look what we found. And even at the time that Dan Brown wrote this, it was a well-known forgery by this right-wing extremist guy, Pierre Plantard. He knew that they were forged. He never mentions the fact that they were forged documents, just that they were found documents. So
yeah, well, it's it's actually one of the ways people forge documents is they will sometimes they'll begin a forgery by indicating how the forgery was found. And so you make up a discovery narrative, and that verifies the truthfulness of it. And so Dan Brown is standing in a very long tradition of people who have either been fooled by this way of doing things or else who have used it themselves.
Or you make the case, too, about the forgeries that exist that whether or not they were included in the Bible that mention whatever you do, be on the lookout for forgeries. But we know it itself is a forgery.
Yes, that's right. So this is a ploy that's used there's a 4th century Christian forgery called the Apostolic Constitutions, which claims to be written by the apostles, even though it was written 300 years after they were dead. And this forgery in the name of the apostles warns its readers, don't read forgeries in the names of the apostles.
Right. Right. Very funny. All right, and then let's mention the Passover plot, because this book, which was never purporting to be a work of fact, still gets mentioned. I still get calls that talk about the theories of the Passover plot as though it were a serious scholarly treatise on what happened at the cross, or there was a documentary that was made on it, and people still talk about that like this was intended to be an expose of what really happened when Christ died.
Well, it supports the point of view that many people find attractive, especially people who really love conspiracy theory. If anyone who really likes conspiracy theory, the Passover plot's the book for them, because it argues that Jesus actually planned his own death, and when he was given the gall mixed with myrrh on the cross, it was actually a narcotic that was designed to make his vital signs slow down. So he actually didn't die on the cross. He survived crucifixion, and that he planned it himself so that he could appear to rise from the dead, and that it was all Jesus' own setup. And so when he allegedly was raised from the dead, it wasn't because he died, because he raised from the dead. It's because he never died in the first place.
And then he only goes on to live for 6 more months, according to the Passover.
Well, he wasn't planning on getting stuck in the side by the spear by this Roman soldier, and so that ended up killing him. That was one contingency that he wasn't able to plan for.
But he doesn't escape to France and have babies with Mary.
No, that's a whole different conspiracy theory.
Right. You know, it's interesting. I did hear, though, that the gall mixed with myrrh, which is given to Christ on the cross, that was intended to be a painkiller or hallucinogenic. There
are debates about what that's all about, but some people have thought that it was meant to be a kind of a painkiller. Although, I don't think you can really kill that much pain.
Well, yeah, it's true. But I've always wondered, well, why doesn't somebody just mix some gall with some myrrh and see what happens?
Yeah, that's a good thing. I'm not sure they even know what it is.
These other Bible scholars you run around with, why not have a gall and myrrh night?
I think we'll stick to bourbon, but thanks.
All right. Well, we're talking with Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. And just to make the point again for people who may be coming in late, what you really, there's a lot of discussions about various books of the Bible, but you really focus on as the forgeries are the ones that make an actual claim to say, I am Paul, and I wrote this book, and here's the reason why you can trust me that it's really Paul, and then goes on to say things, and we know for a fact that was somebody making a false claim and forging a document.
That's right. I'm not talking about people making up stories or whether what they say is theologically right or wrong. I'm simply talking about an author who claims to be somebody other than who he really is. And this was done widely in the Roman world. It was done in the New Testament, and part of my argument is that in the ancient world they looked upon this as a deceitful practice. It was thought of as lying, and so when this happens in the New Testament, we should call it what it is, which is a deceitful lying practice, and our word for that today is forgery.
And we shouldn't be surprised. Look, even in the last 30, 40 years, remember the guy tried to forge the autobiography of Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes was still alive.
Yes, that's right. It happens all the time. And, when I first started thinking about this, it was when the Hitler diaries had come out.
Right.
And everybody was convinced that Hitler had kept these diaries through World War II. Well, they were an absolute forgery done in order to make money. So people still do forgery today. It's just that today it's a lot easier to catch people because we have more sophisticated tools of analysis. In the ancient world, it was a lot harder to catch somebody because they simply didn't have the kind of research tools that we have today.
Well, it's still amazing, and I of course, the Hitler diaries is a good example, but at least even when the Hitler diaries came out, Hitler was dead. What's still so striking to me was the guy attempting to, fake the autobiography of Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes was still alive.
Yes, I know. It's quite striking what some forgers will do. We have instances of that in the ancient world too, of people who famous authors who expose forgeries in their own name, and their reaction is much like a modern person's reaction would be. They simply didn't like it because you weren't supposed to be doing this sort of thing, which shows that in fact even in the ancient world this was looked upon as a deceitful practice.
And if we were to take out all of the books that were forged that are in the New Testament, how many books are we talking about in your estimation?
Well, so there are 27 books in the New Testament, and they all have names attached to them. All 27 have somebody's name attached to them. Some of these books were written by the people whose name they go under, but not very many. You have the 7 letters of Paul that are undisputed, and the book of Revelation was really written by somebody named John, but we don't know which John it was. So that's 8 books. The rest are either anonymous books that have been wrongly attributed to somebody, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Were not really written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And others of them are flat-out forgeries, which, in other words, books where an author claims to be someone other than who he is. And so I would include in that number the 6 disputed Pauline letters. The books of 1st and 2nd Peter were not really written by Peter. Jude wasn't written by Jude. James wasn't written by James. I give evidence for this in the book, by the way. I'm not just kind of claiming this. I show why scholars are pretty sure that these claims are right, that these people didn't really write these books. And so that's mainly what my book is about. So it turns out there are about 11 7 books in the New Testament that in which the author makes a false authorial claim.
I just am reminded when I had a professor named Shirley Guthrie. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was a great guy. And he told me the story once about how the men's room down the hallway at the seminary used to have signs up on the men's toilet stalls that said 1st and 2nd John.
Yes.
You've heard
we had
this?
that at Princeton Seminary, too.
And over the urinals, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter. I thought that,
John, right.
they're very funny. Well, I thought the urinals thing with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter, I thought was very funny. All right, so let's go to Scott in Utica, New York on Coast to Coast for a question for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. Scott?
Yes, I was calling in regards to the Da Vinci Code and the Holy Grail and the bloodline.
Okay.
Okay, and the validity of that. And, Jesus was referred to as a rabbi. And I don't recall ever being questioned, as far as what we read in the New Testament. And the thing was...
I don't know what you mean by that. Well, I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, he was... a lot, his claims to be the son of God, and everything was questioned. But as far as being a rabbi,
okay.
I don't recall that being, he was a rabbi.
Okay.
And he was referred to as that. Well, there was criteria to be a rabbi. I recall, you had to be 30 years of age, I believe, and have a son of 12 years of age.
I don't know about the son. I don't know if I've ever heard that. Certainly, it was expected that if you were a rabbi, you would be married. I mean, that part with that, I've always heard that was the only criteria. Yeah, I've never heard the 30. I've never heard 30 years of age before, because the life expectancy wasn't that old in the in the ancient world. Bart, do you have a thought on this?
The problem with knowing about rabbis in the first century is that all of our evidence comes from later centuries. So we have Jewish writings, in the Mishnah, the Talmud, which are centuries after the first century that do specify certain things about that give us some information about rabbis in those days, but we don't have reliable information about what it meant to be a rabbi in the first century. The term rabbi simply means my teacher, and so Jesus was a teacher. And what most historians think is that the office of rabbi, which had these particular qualifications, is a later development, and that you don't have that before the temple was destroyed in the first century.
Does that help?
Fascinating. Well, given that if he was married, as you mentioned, possibly, that would attest to him having a family and hence a bloodline.
Yeah, but see, the problem is that we don't know that he was married, and you didn't have to be married in the first century to be a teacher. And so later on, maybe that was something that was required, but not in the days of Jesus.
Well, to Scott's point, there's a difference between requirement and expectation. And there was an expectation that you were going to be a family man, you were going to be part of the community. But was it a requirement where they would have said, I'm sorry, you can't be a rabbi yet. You're not married. You don't have kids. That's the part that seems, that's the dividing line. And for the people that say, well, the Da Vinci Code is legitimate because he would have had to have been married and had kids in order for him to be a rabbi, that's the part. It's just the difference between, it would have been common for him to have done that, but it wouldn't have been a requirement. Not that we know of.
No, that's right, and we in fact do know of other rabbis, or other teachers of the first century, other Jewish teachers who were not married, and so it certainly was not a requirement.
Not like it is today, where you're not, if in the Orthodox seminaries to become an Orthodox priest, if you graduate without being married, you can never be married as a priest. So you have to be married before you graduate, or you can't be a married priest. You knew that, right?
Yeah, I think that, the problem is that people, take a tradition that is firmly entrenched today, and they assume that that's how it was back in the days of Jesus. And, when you actually put it that way, of course it sounds ridiculous, but that is what people think. And so, what ended up becoming traditional Judaism wasn't necessarily in force in the first century when Jesus was around.
Jeff is in Culver City, California, on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Jeff?
Yeah, hi, Ian and Mr. Bart Ehrman. Just very quickly, man, I just wanted to ask you guys, given all the current evil that's going on, like the Libyan crisis, problems in the Catholic Church, suicide bombers and all that, I just want to know if religion is becoming obsolete because, apparently nobody's respecting each other or God or, the prophets and messengers. So I just want to know your opinion. Is religion becoming obsolete and irrelevant in this 21st century?
Based on Muammar Gaddafi, problems in the Vatican Church, and what was the third one?
That was like the suicide bombers and terrorists.
Suicide bombers.
Yeah, all that, yeah.
All right. Bart?
Well, it's an interesting thing that in some parts of the world, Christianity and religion in general is becoming obsolete. In parts of Western Europe and in England, I mean, the church seems to be dying. But in most of the world, religion seems to be thriving very much. And so, I think that not just Christianity, but Islam and other religions are thriving. And I think when there's so much pain and misery in the world is when religion tends to do even better. Most of the time when there's such massive suffering, people turn to religion as a source of guidance and help rather than turning away from religion because it doesn't seem to make sense anymore.
Dave is in Los Angeles, first-time caller line on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. The book is Forged. Dave?
Yeah, hi. Yeah,
hi.
Can you hear me?
We'd like to be able to, so speak up. Yep.
Okay. I have, I find it extremely appalling that, last week the Vatican came out and said that Jews didn't kill Jesus Christ. It is absolutely sickening because I have a lot of Jewish friends that have been talking about this for a long time, and I've been telling them, say, look, you guys have to file a massive class action lawsuit against the Roman Catholic Church for having demonized you for 2,000 years, okay? And killed, and like you guys just said, killed. I mean, I know.
Lots of different Christians have done it over the years, and a lot of cases too. Remember, the Vatican didn't do the killing; the kings or the royalty of the particular country did. So I'm just merely saying that just for a point of clarity. So what do you want to? How does this relate to Bart? What's the question for Bart?
Yeah, and so what I wanted to ask Bart, first of all, if he knows about a book called The Christ Conspiracy.
The Christ Conspiracy. Bart, do you know about that?
No, I haven't read that.
Real
quickly,
Dave, you got about 10 seconds on that. What is the book?
It's a girl named Akariah. She wrote this book, and in this book, she says there's a secret gospel of Mark where Jesus Christ is a pedophile.
Oh, well, then that we can talk about. You're talking about the secret gospel of Mark. We can get to then coming up. Still a highly disputed book, and it's not pedophile, by the way, but there is the assertion that Christ is gay, or at least has a intimate experience with a man, and we can get to that coming up with Forged. Bart Ehrman is the author of that, and we'll see. Actually, you might be surprised about that particular secret gospel, the so-called secret gospel of Mark. On the way, too, then we'll get to all of your questions about the biblical documents. I know there's a couple of people hanging on that want to make a claim for specific Bible books on why they should be included, even if they are forged. On the way on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. All right, so heading into our last hour with Bart Ehrman. The new book is Forged, and it is a bold claim for some people, but biblical scholars have been tossing around this concept for a very long time, just unwilling to use the F word like Bart is so clearly. Your questions, your comments on the books of the Bible whose authors are not who we think they are. In fact, we'll never know who they were. Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Taking your questions and comments for biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, and William can't be too far away from you in North Carolina on a wild card line on Coast to Coast. William?
Hey, how you doing there tonight, Ian?
Good. You're talking with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Ehrman. I think you're spot on with your book. Being a amateur scholar of the biblical tent, I have read widely on these things. One of your comments earlier about the condition of humanity, why is there suffering, and you said you became an agnostic, was pretty much spot on with one of the reasons I became involved in Buddhism. Because if you know anything about Buddhism, you know that it's about our desires and why there is suffering in the world. I can see where a lot of the things that come from the Bible also address this, but there's so much political stuff involved in that. What is your take on that? Is a lot of what we see in the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, have to do with touching on that, but also trying to play into the political and, I guess,
I'm not sure I know what you
play?
mean. I'm not sure. So you're talking about the politics of its time. You're saying whether it reflects the politics. Oh, that's a good question. Bart?
Yeah, my view is that most of the authors of the Bible are dealing with this problem of why they're suffering in the world. And, they're naturally wrapped up with events of their own time, and obviously with the political situations that they're confronting. Many of them are, in fact, standing in opposition to the political forces of their world and trying to explain it from a theological point of view. And so, one of the reasons, I wrote this earlier book on the problem of suffering, which was really just focusing on what the biblical authors have to say, because I think that, in fact, you can understand most of what the authors of the Bible are about by situating them in the context, not just of their own world, but also struggling with this issue of theodicy, of why they're suffering in the world.
I think the politics brings us back to the question of the secret gospel of Mark, as this is a highly debated book, but also we can't escape the fact that some of the debate about that book is about the politics of our day and of the first century. Explain the secret gospel of Mark and the case for its validity and the reason why many scholars have turned against it.
Well, it's a long story, but it absolutely involves the question of forgery. So there's a very prominent historian who taught at Columbia University in New York named Morton Smith, who wrote two books in 1973 about this secret gospel that he claimed he discovered in a monastery near Jerusalem 15 years earlier, in 1958. And this gospel was actually what he discovered was a letter allegedly written by one of the church fathers named Clement of Alexandria, which described a second edition of the Gospel of Mark. That Mark published his first edition, which we have now, but that he also wrote a second edition for the initiates into secret knowledge. And this secret gospel, the second edition, contained a couple of stories not found in the New Testament Gospel of Mark, one of which talks about Jesus raising a man from the dead who loved Jesus because of what he had done and came to Jesus at night wearing nothing but a linen cloth over his nakedness, it says. And they spent the night together with Jesus teaching him about the kingdom of God. Well, Morton Smith interpreted this to mean that, in fact, Jesus had sexual relations with this man, and that it was indicative of what Jesus normally did, which is that he would baptize men in the nude and it would have sex with them. And so this is obviously a very highly controversial claim.
And there's nothing in it doesn't explicitly say this is what he did. It just said that they went to the tent and Jesus shared the kingdom of God, and Morton Smith, he interpreted that as meaning the kingdom of, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so, all right. But there's nothing in there that says that. It's just that was his interpretation. But that became very popular with certain people.
Well, it did. And, it was a big controversy when he published these books, but the controversy at the time was over whether his interpretation had any validity or not. What ended up becoming the issue was after he died, some scholars started arguing that, in fact, this discovery never happened, that what happened instead is that Smith himself had forged this account and that this was an instance of modern forgery. And this is a debate that still is raging today among scholars about whether this is something that Smith actually discovered or whether it's something that he invented.
Okay, but a physical copy of the expanded, annotated second edition of the Gospel of Mark does not exist.
No, we don't have it. And, in fact, we don't even have this letter allegedly written by Clement. What we have are photographs of it that Morton Smith took, but the manuscript itself has disappeared.
And the abbot for this monastery, was it a monastery that he saw this letter? It was allowed to.
Yeah, the letter was actually it was copied into the back of into blank pages in the back of an old book, and so he found this old book in the library of the monastery with these pages in the back, and then he photographed it because it wasn't his book, he couldn't take it away, but he could photograph it.
And what did the? Go ahead. I'm sorry. That was my question.
Since then, the book has been the pages were eventually cut out of the book, and the pages have now disappeared. So nobody's seen them for decades.
But is there a provenance there in the monastery? Did they know? They knew of the book. They knew of those pages. They attest to the fact that he was there.
Who saw the book? There's a guy named Guy Strumsa, who's a professor at Oxford University, who in the 1970s tracked down the book and found the book. And so the book actually did exist, and the pages were in the book. The thing is, the letter by Clement is written in Greek, of course, and it's written in an 18th century style of handwriting. And so if Morton Smith forged it, what he did is he learned how to imitate an 18th century style of Greek handwriting, and he made up the letter. So it would have been quite a feat for him to have pulled it off, but a lot of scholars think that that's just what he did.
And then some still maintain, based on his reputation alone, that that a forgery would have been inconsistent with the rest of his work.
Yeah, people who knew him the best say that he wouldn't have done such a thing. But there have been a couple of books written that have mounted pretty convincing cases that, in fact, he did do it, and possibly he did it in order to snub the scholarship in its field to show that he could get away with it.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a little of that you talk about in the book Forged. We're talking with Dr. Bart Ehrman, and we've got Andy in Los Angeles on Coast to Coast. Andy?
Hi, Ian. Great show. Mr. Ehrman, I have a few questions for you. May I ask you, sir, just to find out where you're coming from, what was your background as far as your faith? Did you have any particular belief in any particular religion in the past?
We went over this earlier, Andy, so I'll just sum it up real quickly. We've gone over this a couple of times. He was a conservative evangelical Christian, graduated from Moody, then also from Wheaton before he began to learn the Semitic and the classic languages and to be able to read the Bible himself, and eventually led to his stance right now where he's agnostic.
I see.
Your question?
Yeah, the question is this. Among mainstream theologians and researchers such as yourself, would you say that you have a wide acceptance of your opinion by those other conservatives? Well, you were once a conservative. You're obviously not a conservative any longer based upon what you're saying. Is your belief system pretty consistent with among the conservative theologians and researchers, or is it just a...
I would say just based on your question alone, you're answering it. He's inconsistent with the conservative theologians, but who reads you, Bart, and what's the feedback you get from mainstream biblical scholarship?
Right. So my views are pretty much in line with mainstream scholarship. I think what puts me apart is that I communicate what mainstream scholars are saying to a popular audience. And most scholars, of course, don't communicate with normal human beings.
Exactly.
And
they don't know how.
Right, they don't know how, or yeah. So, but in terms of mainstream scholarship, I'm not a radical at all. I wrote a textbook on the New Testament for college level students, and it's the most widely used textbook in the country. So, what I'm saying is fairly standard stuff. It's just that it's the sort of stuff that most people have never heard of.
I was actually wondering that when I was reading Forged. How often have you ever been invited to speak at Moody in Chicago, Moody Bible Institute in Chicago?
No, I never have, but I do get invited a lot to talk to very conservative evangelical seminaries. Usually what they do is they have me do a public debate. And so a couple weeks ago, I was at the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, where I had a public debate with an evangelical Christian scholar named Craig Evans on whether the Gospels are reliable or not. And so I do that sort of thing a lot at conservative places, but it's usually in order to contrast me with one of their own.
You're, if this were professional wrestling, you're the guy wearing the black hood, basically.
Yeah,
right?
I guess that's right. Yeah, all right.
You're not the one they're rooting
like
for.
A wrestling match.
You're not the one they're rooting for. All right, Mark is in Portland, Oregon, on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Go ahead, Mark.
Good evening, fellas. Good show.
Thank you.
The question I have here is, what do you make of a reference? I have a David Icke book here, and he references an author who put out a book in 1979, The True Authorship of the New Testament, by I don't know how you say his name, Abelard Rushlin. Abelard Rushlin.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with it.
Well, his claim is that the New Testament and the church and Christianity, all of them, were all a creation of the Calpurnius Piso family, who were Roman aristocrats. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Roman aristocrats.
Yeah.
That's kind of new for me, although I did find the reference, and I'm looking at it right here. The Abelard Rushlin Foundation is what I'm finding here, and there is a book on Amazon about the true authorship of the New Testament. Boy, that would be quite a feat if one person had written all of the variety of books and taken all these different poses, right? Because, that's sort of the interesting thing about the New Testament is you can even tell even within the Gospels that there's really distinctly different writing styles.
Yeah, no, it's like having a novel by Mark Twain and a novel, or just you compare Mark Twain with T.S. Eliot or somebody. It's just like they're so
right.
different in writing, and you get that kind of difference in the New Testament. So people manage to publish all sorts of books, and no one should believe them simply because they find information in a book. The question is whether it can stand up to critical analysis or not. And the idea that the New Testament was written by an aristocratic Roman family, it would not take very much effort to show that that's completely wrong.
Okay, but you are willing to say right here unequivocally, you wrote your book Forged. You're not right. You're not pulling one over on us by hiring somebody else.
I've thought maybe I should write some pseudonymous works, and publish them in somebody else's name, just for fun. But so far I haven't done that yet.
All right. Jerry is in Corning, California, on Coast to Coast. Jerry?
Hi guys.
Hi.
My question is, it's actually twofold. The first part is something that always perplexed me back in my fundamentalist days. Did the Christians have the early Christians have a concept of incorruptibility regarding the flesh, and that they expected to remain alive if they stayed pure enough? Because we have that one scripture where Jesus is saying, there are some standing here among you that shall not taste of death until they see all these things fulfilled. And he talked about the stars falling out of heaven and so forth,
right.
Again coming. And so that obviously didn't occur in this generation shall not pass until all these things are filled. Well, that generation passed, and they are, sick, and they were sleeping, Paul said to the church, and this is why, because you came to communion with the wrong motives. So I'm wondering, was there an early belief in incorruptibility of the flesh, and they were expecting it to happen in their day? And the second part is, what strong connection, if any, is there with the Essene party? and what they believed and how it influenced Jesus. So thank you. I'll take my answers off the air. Thanks, guys.
Very good.
Yeah, no, those are good questions, and I think they can be answered pretty easily. The early Christians did not believe in the incorruptibility of the flesh. What they believed was that the flesh would corrupt and would rot away, but at the end of the age, God would raise people from the dead and then at that point give them incorruptible flesh. So that the early Christian belief was not that your soul would die and go to heaven. It was that you would be raised from the dead and eternal life would be lived here on earth in the flesh, but flesh that was made immortal. And in response to the second question about the Essenes, this point of view was also shared by other Jewish groups, including the Essenes, that at the end of the age there would be this resurrection of the flesh. And so the Essenes, who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, also held to this view that was shared with Jesus, and then of course with Jesus' followers.
And that speaks back to the Ezekiel prophecy about them bones, them dry bones that would come, that flesh would be restored, that people. So it was an early Christian belief. It was tied into a Judaic belief too.
Yeah, that's right. It came out of Judaism. So this idea of a resurrection of the flesh started up in Judaism. It became a dominant view within Judaism of the first century. It's a view that Jesus had, John the Baptist had it, and so as a result of that, the Christians ended up with this doctrine of the resurrection as well.
Fernando is in El Paso, Texas, on Coast to Coast for Dr. Bart Ehrman. Go ahead, Fernando.
Greetings, gentlemen. Interesting show.
Thank you.
I was raised in a fundamentalist church, mainstream Baptist, and around the age of 15 or 16, I started questioning interpretations on different Bible verses and the general teachings, and here, 65 years later, I'm still questioning things and trying to find answers about many things, and I've changed my interpretations about a lot of the Bible.
And what we know from last week's guest is that's helped keeping your brain very active. And it's good for your brain to do that kind of questioning and that kind of thinking. You had a question for Bart that we can get an answer for after the break?
My lingering question is, and number one on my list is, why do so many professed Christians get upset and have this enmity toward Judas and toward Jews because of the crucifixion of Jesus, if they really believe that Jesus' main purpose was to come here to be crucified as a sacrifice?
Well, that is a paradox, and I'll give Dr. Ehrman a chance to answer that coming up in just a minute on Coast to Coast, and then we'll clear out this line so that we can get you in if you're trying to get through. International line's taken, Skype line is taken. We'll give the numbers pro forma coming up in just a moment, but I don't know how many more calls we'll be able to take than the ones that are up on the screen right now. But hang on if you're there. We'll get you hooked up with Forged. Dr. Bart Ehrman next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Okay, it's like a full boat. Like we're out on a stormy sea. We're going to have to walk on the water to get to shore if we're going to get everybody there. So hang on. All the callers are hanging on. We hope you will too. For Dr. Bart Ehrman, the book is Forged next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Let's get to him as quickly as we can, but first let's go back to that question, Bart, that hung out there at the bottom of the hour. Want to address that?
Yeah, so it is an interesting phenomenon that Christians say that Jesus had to die on the cross, and yet they blame people for making it happen. And so I think that is one of the paradoxes of the Christian tradition. My sense, though, is that Christian anti-Judaism isn't really about whether Jews are at fault for killing Jesus. It's because Christians, in order to justify their own existence in the early church, had to set themselves up over against the Jews. And so the Jews became the enemy, and Christians throughout history then inherited this tradition that Jews were the bad guys.
And so it's kind of a convenient thing that you can tack onto it. It's not the main argument, but it's like it becomes one of those things that it's difficult to argue with, especially, and as you see, as you point out in the book, you look at the historical progression of the Gospels, Mark being written first, then Matthew, then Luke, then John, and then later on the forged Gospel of Peter, that they each amp up the anti-Semitism as they go along.
That's right, and it becomes even worse in later forged documents. And so I think the idea that Jews killed Jesus becomes the excuse for why Christians might want to oppose Jews, but it's not really the reason. I think it's the excuse.
Yeah. Did you ever read the book Judas by Susan Gubar?
No, I did not.
She's married to my. She's the second wife of my wife's uncle, and she wrote Judas, a biography. I thought it was very interesting. Let's get to Caroline, who's in Montreal on an international line for Bart Ehrman on Coast to Coast. Caroline?
Bonjour. I wanted to ask Bart two questions. Does he believe that all the suffering in the world is caused by God? Because I only see man as the guilty party. And number two, does he believe that confession was used as a way of the church to gain personal information on its public?
Well, those are both good questions. I don't blame suffering on God because I don't believe God exists, and so the answer to that would be no. I think a lot of human suffering is what you say. It's because humans do evil things to one another, and a lot of suffering is because nature is a very capricious thing, and we sometimes get in the way of it. And so, I don't think the tsunami in Japan was caused by free will. It was caused by natural forces, and it created a lot of suffering. I don't think that confession was put in place so that so that the church could get juicy details on the private lives of people who confess to their priests. I think that there's a whole range of reasons for why confession came to be part of the Roman Catholic Church, but I don't think it was just so they could get information on people.
Toslin is in Beaumont, Texas. First-time caller on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Toslin?
Yes, hi. Hi, Ian. Hi, Mr. Ehrman. I have two questions. My question is, I just heard you say that you didn't believe in God, and I think you're onto something about the Bible, but my questions are, how do you think the God feel about the truth being told about the Bible, and do you think the Vatican knows and is hiding a lot about what's going on in the Bible?
Yeah, good question. I don't think God has any feelings one way or the other about it because I don't think God exists, and so I don't think that
you're going to keep going to that well every time somebody asks.
I think my view though is that if what scholars are saying about the Bible is true, that people who believe in God ought to agree, because truth is more important than holding on to views that aren't right. And so I'm very much in support of looking for the truth rather than simply accepting views that people have always held because they think God wants them to hold these views. I think if there is a God, he's certainly supportive of the truth. And
the Vatican question. The Vatican question. It's sort of the Vatican conspiracy.
Oh, are they hiding things? I don't think they are. No, I think that in fact, there's not there aren't secret gospels and things being held by the Vatican because they're afraid of what'll happen if they get out. I simply don't think that's true at all.
They drag their feet pretty well on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I think that helped feed that prejudice a lot, that they're just manipulating information and they're trying to keep us from knowing the truth and all the things that later were reflected in the Da Vinci Code. I think I think they may be guilty of some intellectual arrogance.
Yeah, I'm sure that's happened over the centuries, but I think that, and I'm not a big supporter of the Vatican or the Roman Catholic hierarchy. I think that, in fact, it's highly problematic, but I don't think that they're hiding information from us about ancient Christianity that would be destructive if released.
Do you know, you've written many books on the Gnostic texts and on the banned books from the Bible and that sort of thing. Do we know what the Vatican has in terms of whether they allow, how open they are with allowing scholars to see these works? Do they not collect books that they also find heretical?
Right. So I've never I have written a lot about books that didn't make it in, the lost gospels and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I've never worked in the Vatican Library. I've been there, but I haven't done any serious research there. But I know people who have, and there isn't this kind of cloak of secrecy that people imagine. People do have access to the Vatican's collections, and scholars use the Vatican's collections, and so I don't think they've got secret rooms where they're hiding things.
But do they collect the books even that they find heretical? Do they?
Yeah, I mean the Vatican Library has vast holdings, and they don't simply. It's not like my bookstore when I was at Moody Bible Institute, where the only books you could find in the bookstore were ones that happened to agree with the views of the Moody Bible Institute. The Vatican isn't really set up that way.
Will they, at the Vatican Library, have a copy of Forged, do you think?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I think if they don't, they ought to probably buy multiple copies.
Which I imagine would be your position on anybody thinking of buying the book.
Yes, I think, in fact, they make very nice birthday presents.
So Forged, the new book by Bart Ehrman. Rob is in Minneapolis. He's Skyping tonight on Coast to Coast. Rob?
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
Good. Go ahead.
All right, so originally my question was about the Pagan Christ book, but before I mention that, just about the Jews and early Christianity, I mean, we know that the church was, trying to enforce laws that the people, the Bavarian people or whatever, weren't really digging, and eventually they started to force the laws upon the people. So in a way, you're talking about a manufactured, Judeophobia that, is very clear historically that happened, But the Pagan Christ, what's your take on that? It basically proves. Yeah, I mean, what's up with that? The book and the CBC documentary.
Right. So there's there are increasing number of people who think that Christ is an invention based on pagan myths about dying and rising God, and that Jesus himself never existed, but that was a early sort of fictional invention. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that this idea that Jesus, the characteristics of Jesus, were entirely taken over from pagan myths about other divine beings is wrong. And so my next book is actually going to be on the question, did Jesus exist? Where I'm going to mount the historical evidence that has convinced just about every serious historian that, of course, Jesus did exist. The question is, what can we say about him?
So we could put this down as, for Bart Ehrman, God does not exist. Jesus existed. Jesus was not then divine.
That's my view, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Jesus did exist, but he wasn't God, because I don't think God exists.
Tim is in Cleveland on Wildcard Line 4 on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, hi. Does Bart do most of his scholarship from reading Western literature, or does he read Hebrew texts?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I do read Hebrew texts. I read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew.
Go ahead, Tim. Well, hang on one second, Tim. Go ahead, Bart. Tell all the languages you read. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You know, scholars who have PhDs in New Testament have to learn all sorts of languages. So
go ahead.
So over the years, I've learned Hebrew and Greek and Latin and Coptic and Syriac, and of course you also have to be able to read French and German because you have to read scholarship in those fields. So that doesn't make me unusual as a scholar. Most scholars, good scholars in my field, can read these languages.
There you go. Tim, go ahead.
Well, average Christians, are at the mercy of translations that we're reading because we don't read the ancient languages.
Yes.
But one of the arguments was about whether Mary had to be a virgin in the translation in Hebrew. And obviously we have words today that make it clear whether they're a young girl or not, whether they're a virgin or not. And it's surprising that if that was an important issue, that they didn't use language to make that clear.
You're talking about the maiden versus virgin
That Mary had to be a virgin. A lot of people think it's very important that she be a virgin. The other question I would have, after Joseph and Mary were betrothed, would they have had intercourse prior to Jesus being born?
Okay, so the first question has to do with the Hebrew text in the book of Isaiah 7:14. There's a prediction that a young girl will conceive and bear a child, and the word that is used there in the Hebrew is alma, which is a word that just means a young woman. It doesn't mean that she's a sexual virgin. But later, when the Gospel of Matthew quoted that verse, it quoted it in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which used the Greek word parthenos. Well, parthenos it came to mean a girl who's never had sex. And so that's where the idea of the virgin birth came from, is that it was a mistranslation of the Hebrew alma. Would Joseph and Mary have had sex? I have no way of knowing.
Well, actually, I have something I can offer that. The claim is that during that period of betrothal, when after they were allowed to travel together and they were publicly proclaimed as being a couple but not yet married, the belief is that the expectation was there would be no intercourse, but it was, and this I've done some research on this, and I don't have it all here in front of me, but trust me on this, that there are arguments to be made that it would not inconsistent, there would be some sort of physical contact, because the whole point of a betrothal period was to start to create the bond between the young man and his would-be young wife. So
the reason I said we don't know is because even though we might know things about how Jewish betrothals work, I don't think we know really what Joseph and Mary's particular situation was.
Exactly. In particular, we can't know that. But it would have been, the question is whether it would have been consistent for them to have had some.
If they really traveled together to Bethlehem, then you might be able to draw some conclusions. But my view is that's a story that's found in the Gospel of Luke, but I don't think is a historically accurate story.
David is in Missouri, wildcard line for Bart Ehrman on Coast to Coast. David?
Professor, I was raised with the old-time religion and Ozarks, and could only read the Bible. And when I was 8 or 9, I ran across a verse that did me well in my life, and it was in Galatians. And it said they were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they searched the scriptures daily whether or not those things were so. And boy, did I want to be noble. And it has certainly helped me out of the morass of religion. And now it would be perfect if Galatians was one of your forged books. Is it?
No.
No, it's not.
Oh,
I'm afraid your verse though doesn't come from Galatians. It comes from the Book of Acts.
Oh man!
which I think in fact is a forgery.
Well, so there you go. Maybe David, in the end, you get your forgery. Michael is in Nevada on Coast to Coast for Bart Ehrman. Michael.
Hello. My question is, other than contradiction, what are the methods that scholars use to come to the conclusion that a book is a forgery? The reason I say other than contradiction is because I completely discount that simply because an author may contradict himself thousands of times because he's someone who happens to contradict himself.
All right, well, hang on, Michael.
Prove anything, but I'm interested in
Okay, Michael, well, let's get an answer for you here. Go ahead. We're running out of time.
Well, I'll give you an example. The books of 1st and 2nd Peter claim to be written by Peter. What I argue in my book, Forged, is that Simon Peter was not literate, that he wasn't able to write at all. And I give the arguments for why it's almost certain that Peter could not write. And so, well, that'd be a reason for thinking that he didn't write these books, that he didn't write anything. And so that was, that.
Okay, but he could have gone to a scribe and dictated. Why not that?
Well, I show why that can't work either, because we know how scribes worked in the ancient world. We know how secretaries worked and how people composed books, and it never worked that way. So that whenever if Peter dictated 1 Peter, he would have had to be literate enough to be able to compose orally. But we know that Peter was illiterate. In fact, the New Testament says he was illiterate in the book of Acts. And so he didn't have the kinds of literary skills needed in order to compose the book, either orally or in writing.
There's another argument, too, on the literary criticism of the Bible that says you look at the way that phrases were constructed or ideas were expressed. It's more than just whether they contradict themselves. There's consistency to certain books that is undeniable in the way it was almost as though somehow somewhere midlife or late in life, one of these writers of the Bible just decided, I'm going to change completely the way I write and completely the way I think toward the end of their life. And that's
right. I mean,
rare.
if you discover a poem and you today, and it doesn't have an author's name attached to it, you can pretty well tell whether it was something written by T.S. Eliot or by Emily Dickinson. I mean, they don't write the same.
Right. Well, Lola is in Linwood, Washington, on Coast to Coast, and we'll try to get one more in too after this. Lola, go ahead.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Amazing. I've never called in a radio show ever. Okay, I'm talking about homosexuality. Apostle Paul wrote about it in 1 Corinthians, and it's been quoted again in 1 Timothy and in Romans, and as you know, also in the Old Testament. And I presuppose that you do not speak Aramaic, the old language. But meanwhile, I have a gay son, and we love him very much, and we do believe that he loves God and so forth. But I'm wondering what your view is about how the Bible brings that out. Is there really a condemnation of homosexuality or of the homosexual act, or it's just how it is? Or
lot to get to in 60 seconds here, Lola, but give it a shot, Bart.
Well, I don't think that the Bible authors had any conception of what we think of as homosexuality, because people in the ancient world did not have any sense of what we think of as sexual orientation. They didn't know that human beings had sexual orientation. The Bible does condemn same-sex acts, either male or female, but one needs to put that in the ancient context. You can't simply take a verse that condemns something from 2,000 years ago and pretend that it applies to the modern context, because we have a whole different way of looking at the world, including the sense that people have a sexual orientation and certain sexual drives, which is something that the ancient people didn't have any sense of at all. And so it simply isn't appropriate to take a verse out of its historical context and pretend that it's relevant to today. So I actually don't think that the Bible does condemn what we think of as homosexuality.
That's where it will have to be stand for now, but no surprise it should end on a controversial moment with Bart Ehrman. So thank you. Just the way it starts, it's just the way it ends. Forged, the name of the new book that's out there. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it again, and that means you'll come back again when you finish your new book coming up, because I think that sounds very interesting too. As always, Deus te amat, and I do too.